I come here to rate and review Doctor Who The Savages, not to unbox it. But I might do a little unboxing while I'm at it. Good stuff. My name is B. Paul Mounts. Yes, it's here. Doctor Who The Savages, the latest animated reconstruction of a missing Doctor Who serial, has arrived. And I've come to the conclusion that Amazon isn't quite as reliable as it once was in terms of getting things before they're actually physically released. Used to be, if you ordered something in advance, you might get it a day or two before release, but that doesn't seem to happen now. I got my copy of The Savages yesterday, Monday, which is the day of release, so I can't complain too much, but I know a lot of people were getting theirs on Friday and Saturday, so I might in future order from Zavi, who seem to be one of the more reliable, or possibly HMV. Something to think about. But anyway, it's here, Doctor Who The Savages, the latest in a long line of animated reconstructions of old Doctor Who serials, and the more and more of these are done and released, the more and more I think we have to accept that we're not going to see these actual original old episodes. They're not coming back. We've had, over the years, a drip of returned episodes from various overseas broadcasters, but that's pretty much dried up now. We've not had anything back since, I think, 2013, when we had those missing episodes of the Web of Fear and the entirety of Enemy of the World returned. So yeah, I don't think there's anything else out there now, so I think we're going to have to put up with the animations. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because at least it gives us a visual representation of what these stories were like. They are a bit hit and miss. I mean, they're low budget animation, we all know that, so we don't expect the bells and whistles of Pixar and so on. But they serve their purpose in filling in those gaps in the collection. So the latest one to be released is an odd one, I must admit, of the ones that are still outstanding to be released. I suppose we've had all the Dalek stories now that are missing. Well, we haven't actually. We haven't had the Dalek Master Plan. We've had several Cybermen stories. There's still the Wheel in Space to do. But The Savages strikes me as a very odd one to release, because it's, let's just say, not one of the most celebrated of William Hartnell's stories. It's one that's sort of been forgotten because it's always been thought to be a bit ordinary. And I've watched it now, so I can tell you whether it's ordinary or not. In fact, I spent all of last night, pretty much all of last night, slogging my way through the story and then watching the special features on the Blu-ray disc. And there are some very special features here. But before we go any further, I will just do a sort of a unboxing type thing. So here's the disc, then the Blu-ray edition. I didn't go for the Steelbook, the bog standard Blu-ray. Nice sort of vibrant, orangey sort of cover. It's something that looks a bit like William Hartnell. The TARDIS spears look like knitting needles sticking out of it, but they're actually spears which have been thrown at it. And Dodo and Peter Purvis's Stephen Taylor hiding away behind the TARDIS. It's, you know, I could have wished for a slightly better image than this. But, you know, there we are. That's what we've got. On the back then we have the usual stuff, a few illustrations from the animation, description of the story, and the list of special features, which are, as I said, very special on this one. It's a slip cover, which comes off like that, and there is the image repeated on the cover. On the back cover, opens up then. It's a very generous 3-disc set. On the first disc, we get the black and white animated serial, which is what I chose to watch this time. I'll explain shortly. Then we get the colorized version on the second disc with some bonus features. And disc 3 is purely bonus features. And for completists and fans and so on, you do get a reversible sleeve, which is done in the style of the Doctor Who DVD collection, including the old Doctor Who logo. It's done, obviously, spine and so on, to match up with the old DVD. So those completists who want to have them all on their shelf in chronological transmission order can do so. You will have to sort of set aside the slip cover if you want to do that, of course. I just bung them on my shelves as they are. I don't really bother integrating them with my DVDs because it may be a bit OCD, but DVDs and Blu-rays don't belong shelves together. It's unholy, it's ungodly. And of course you also get in the sets, just so you know, the usual Doctor Who merchandise little thing telling you all the other bits of stuff you can get. You subscribe to Doctor Who magazine, you can get audios, all the usual stuff. I was going to call it tack, but that would be offensive. Much more interesting though is this little booklet that you get. This is a, I don't know, 12-page booklet, which gives you a brief history of the story with some illustrations from the animation. That goes over about 4 pages. That's quite interesting. There's a bit of straightforward background and a little section at the end which says the sad history of the BBC junking the old stories. And that goes on for a little bit, and then you get a little couple of pages on the special features. So it is like the Blu-ray season box set in microcosm, a short version of them to encompass the 4-part story. I'm going to talk at greater length actually about the special features because they are really very good on this. The serial itself then, okay, I watched it in black and white. The reason I watched it in black and white, as I said, I've watched the colour ones previously and I've always found them a bit garish. The colour is a bit too brutal, and I think the colorized versions or the color animations have for me exposed the creative difficulties in realizing the sets of the original TV episodes. Now, very often in the past, and I can understand why, the producers of these things, they need to be a bit imaginative as well. They don't just want to try and recreate what was filmed on small BBC studios back in the 60s. They want to have a bit of imaginative license. But I felt that sometimes what they've put on screen is so far removed from what was probably on screen, it might as well be a completely different programme. I'm thinking of things like Galaxy 4, which have these huge, massive, cavernous sets with these tiny figures sort of moving about in them, and it just didn't convince me that I was watching the story. So I watched it in black and white, and I think that's a bit more atmospheric. You do lose some detail, I think, unfortunately, in terms of the animation, because it is, by its nature, quite a black and white story anyway, because of what it's about. But I think sometimes the contrast in things like Dodo's costume, I think in black and white you lose any detail in terms of buttons on her blouse and folds and so on. That sort of disappears a little bit. And I think that the exteriors, because this was a story that had a fair bit of location filming, because at the time the new producer Ennis Lloyd wanted to open the show up a little bit and make it a bit less constrained to being in the studio. So there was more location filming, which, as one of the documentaries points out, caused problems in terms of scheduling, because sometimes they were right up against the wire in getting these episodes ready for transmission. So you lose the sort of location detail. There's particularly scenes at the beginning where the TARDIS lands in a quarry, which represents an alien planet. And if you've seen the photographs, and there are plenty of photographs on this set, you will see the location stuff. And it has a look to it that the animation can't capture, because and the animation just has a few rocks lying around and a bit of vegetation. But this is quite a well populated in terms of vegetation and so on quarry area. There was quite a lot going on, and you don't get the striations of the rocks and stuff like that. You just get pretty much sort of basic line drawings of the rocks. Story itself has over the years been pretty much forgotten. It's one of those stories towards the end of William Hartnell's era, when the show was running out of steam, as I mentioned, I think, on a previous video, the Gunfighters. I think I said that the show was sort of wandering a little bit and losing its audience, and this is a fine example of that, because the viewing figures were quite low for this. I think it started off at 4.8 million, rose to about 5.6, ended up with around 5 million. It's a far cry from the heady days of Dalek Mania, which were in fact only a year before and into this year. But this is a very simplistic story, which is, I think, not necessarily a bad thing. The story basically is that Dr. Stephen and Dodo land on this, what appears to be this desolate, rocky planet. The Doctor, however, says he knows exactly where it is. They've landed in a time of great peace and prosperity, and he goes out to investigate with this little device which he's holding, which unfortunately is called a reacting vibrator. I don't know what the hell he does with that. He wanders off and he gets captured by these characters in costumes with these ray gun type things, and Dodo and Stephen are attacked by savages who, as you see on the cover, sort of throw spears at them. So we become aware that there are 2 different levels to this society. There's the technocrats, the elders who live in their city. They have great technology. They've made fantastic scientific strides. They know of the Doctor, which is an interesting part of the story. They point out that they've been following his travels in the TARDIS. They've been watching him and waiting for him to arrive. They don't go into any detail about his adventures, or his companions, but they've known where he is in the universe. And out in the wilderness, we have the savages, who are sort of cavemen, and Dodo, in fact, thinks they are cavemen. she thinks the Doctor's got it wrong. They've actually gone back to prehistoric times. But these cavemen can communicate, and it's quite clear that there's a conflict between the elders and the savages. And the conflict, as we discover, spoilers, is that the elders are using the savages and draining their life force from them to prolong their lives. They're almost like vampires in a way, not in the Dracula sense, but they are sucking the energy out of these savages who are then cast aside. The Doctor discovers what's going on, puts a stop to it. End. That is pretty much it, really. I mean, that is all there is to it. There's not a lot there. There's a couple of escapes and recaptures. There's a couple of sort of ray gun battles. The elders have got these light guns, which are animated quite well with sort of beams of light that sort of turn people into statues, freeze them. But when we discover what the secret is, and I don't think it, even if you didn't know as a Doctor Who fan what the story was about, I think you'd guess fairly quickly. You've got these exhausted, ragged-looking savages and these sprightly, spry elders in the city. And I think you can resolve fairly quickly what the conflict is, what's going on here. But it's quite competently done. I think the strengths of this are that the audio quality is absolutely fantastic. And it's been spruced up and it's absolutely crystal clear. And that does help you follow the story, not that it's hugely complicated. Because I remember, and this is one of my little fan memories, back in about 1978, when I became aware of sort of Doctor Who fandom being quite active, the Doctor Who Appreciation Society would make available for its members audio recordings of old Doctor Who stories. And of course, this is the time when the whole history of Doctor Who was still a closed book, because we didn't have DVDs, we didn't have repeats on TV, VHSs, Blu-ray. We had none of this. We just had to remember it or read about it in books. And I managed to get hold of a copy of the audio of the Savages. Vibrator. So you really couldn't hear what was going on. And it is quite a visual story anyway, because there's a lot of crashing about and banging around, especially the last episode where they smashed up all the elders' equipment. So I didn't really get much out of that audio. I don't think I ever heard all of it, and probably threw it away in the end. But the audio here is so sharp. Mark Ayres, who does a lot of restoration work on these audios, which we're lucky to have because these were recorded off the TV at the time by a fan called Graham Strong, who I believe is no longer with us. And he had these audios that he recorded. Apparently he plugged his tape recorder directly into the back of the TV, which is an incredibly dangerous thing to do, I think. So there was no distortion. There was no picking up the sound effects of "Graham, your tea's ready" sort of thing you often had if you recorded Doctor Who off the TV. And so this is a really good quality recording. It's been sharpened up. It really does sound so clear, to the extent that you would think it was recorded last week. It's superb. And that does help the flow of the animation, because you follow what's going on a lot better. In terms of the animation itself, yeah, it's, it's what we're used to, really. It's no better, it's no worse. I think there's some slightly better fluidity of motion. I think people move a bit better, and some of that's better. As you'll see from the cover, the likeness of William Hartnell is vague at best. Peter Purves is quite well done. I think Jackie Lane is quite well done. But I think William Hartnell had a particular look, a particular bone structure, which I don't think the animation really quite captures. So all in all, in terms of the story, it's fine. It's perfectly fine, and it's nice to have it. It's nice to see it. But having said that, I watched it last night, and it hasn't made a big imprint on my brain. I would never hold it out as being a great example of a William Hartnell Doctor Who story. And I think, unfortunately, if we saw the original version, the film version, it was directed by Christopher Barry, who was a very experienced director, a very experienced Doctor Who director. He directed a lot before, he directed a hell of a lot afterwards. And I think we would get a better feeling for it. And I think seeing the actors' performances, their facial tics, their movements, because this is animation which, because of the limitations of the budget, can't do enough to put across what the story would have been like. So whilst it's nice to have the chance to reevaluate the story and follow it a bit better, the animation doesn't do it any particular favours in elevating it out of its sort of trough of, yeah, it's fine, that it's currently in. However, if you were thinking, I don't know if I want this, is this essential purchase? It's a bit of a mid-tier Doctor Who. You need to buy this because of two of the special features. Now, the Blu-ray sets, normally, they have a few little bits, an animated documentary about how they made it, or maybe a short half-hour making of. But they've really gone to town on this, and I'm not entirely sure why, to be honest, because there are 2 documentaries on this. Both of them are extremely long. There's a 100-minute making of documentary, which is in essence as long as the story itself. And when you consider that there's no or very little footage from the story itself, to make a 100-minute documentary about the making of it is quite something. But the documentary on here, which is cheekily called Remembering Forgetting the Savages, is one of the best I have ever seen on the Doctor Who range. And that includes all the stuff we've had on the Blu-ray sets and all the DVD stuff over the years. So well done. And these documentaries are getting better and better. And this is absolutely superb. It's hosted by the ever-brilliant Toby Haydock. And it's the conceit of it is that there's a savage caveman in a quarry-type location. And he finds a recording which has got clips from the story. It's a slightly sort of shonky framework for it, but it sort of works. And that acts as a springboard then into all the documentary stuff, which looks into the history of the programme. Toby Haydock goes to the BBC's script library in Caversham, where there's so much detail about the making of BBC programmes, and most Doctor Who serials have files about their production. But there aren't many files for this particular era of Doctor Who, and there's nothing at all about the Savages. So with the help of Richard Bignell, who is a Doctor Who fan who does a lot of stuff about the making of Doctor Who and locations and stuff, they sort of pieced together the history of how the story was made, where it was made. They tried to track down the actual location because, of course, there's no documents to support that. There's loads of archive clips of behind-the-scenes stuff of various other TV shows that the cast have been in. There's interviews with surviving members of the cast. There's quite a poignant little bit with an actor called Robert Sidaway, who appears in this serial, who is now 92, and he lives with his wife. They both later appeared in Doctor Who, and they're quite switched on, and it's quite interesting, and that's why this thing is called Remembering Forgetting It, because Robert Sidaway pretty much forgotten it. He looked at the photographs and memories come back. But this was made 34, 58 years ago, and it was a week's work for a lot of people, and they moved on to do other things, bigger things, better things. You wouldn't expect them to remember a lot about the making of this one Doctor Who serial, and most of them don't. Some of them do. There are some nice little memories here from some of the actors. It's quite interesting that quite a few of the supporting actors are still here. And of course, Peter Purves is here, and he's interviewed at his home, and of course he's in his 80s now, but he's still very sharp, and he talks about his time in Doctor Who, as he has done before. He talks about his relationship with William Hartnell. He talks about how bitter he felt and still feels about the way he was written out of Doctor Who, virtually at a week's notice. That's the way it worked in those days. Innes Lloyd had come along, decided to get rid of the old guard of companions and bring in some new modern companions, because he felt that the show hadn't done anything to fill in the backgrounds of these characters. And then he introduced 2 new characters, Ben and Polly, proceeded to do exactly the same. So after their first stories, we didn't know any more about them than we did at the beginning. But that's by the by, that was how Doctor Who worked back then. So Peter Purves' memories are very sharp, and he talks about his career and working on Doctor Who, working with William Hartnell, and it all fits together in this wonderfully entertaining 100 minutes that's informative, amusing, sad, poignant, and sometimes thought-provoking, because they talk about, this story was originally called The White Savages, and there's a certain racial element to it, and there's some talk about the makeup that the actors used. It almost looks as if they were in blackface, although it's suggested that perhaps they were given a sort of golden pallor to suggest the effect of the energy absorption where they were draining energy from the Savages. It makes the story better, actually, watching the documentary, because it shows you that perhaps it does have layers. It's just unfortunate that the version that we have now, as animated version, can't expose those layers, where perhaps the live action version would have done. It's a brilliant documentary, and it was 100 minutes that just absolutely gripped me. Equally entertaining is a 90-minute feature about Innes Lloyd, the producer at the time. He produced Doctor Who for 2 years, and for years he's just been a name I've been aware of associated with Doctor Who. Producer Innes Lloyd. And then a new producer came along, I think Peter Bryant took over, and you just move on with the history of Doctor Who. But this, I feel now that I know a lot more about Innes Lloyd than I ever knew before, because this goes right back through his career. His widow is still alive. People he worked with are still alive, and some of these people are quite respected industry figures. And I was so impressed by the fact that this documentary, which was directed by Charles Norton and narrated by Jane Asher, it attracted some very well-known people to talk in a documentary for a Doctor Who DVD. Now, obviously, they're not talking about Doctor Who things because that was a small period of his life. But the documentary goes through his history of working on television, the incredibly prodigious career he had after Doctor Who on things like 30-minute theatre, loads of Alan Bennett dramas. He worked very closely with Alan Bennett as he broke into television. Alan Bennett's actually interviewed. There's footage of him here talking about working with Innes Lloyd. Michael Palin from Monty Python is here. It's a really thorough piece that goes right through his career, and it's a fascinating look back at the history of the BBC in a way. He was passionate about the BBC. He was passionate about the BBC's ability to put plays on TV. He wasn't interested in films. A lot of his stuff was studio based, and he made the best of the facilities available to make classic bits of television. And there are loads of archive clips from things that he's done. Again, frustratingly, a lot of his stuff is missing. He did this thing called 30-minute theatre, which was literally half-hour plays every week for most of the year. And there's only about 18 of the 100 or so that were done that still exist at the BBC. It's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating look at the life of somebody who, as I said, has just been a name on a credit to me in the past. And you sort of think, especially at that time, I think producers became a little bit more flamboyant, perhaps in the 70s and 80s, and a bit more visual. And certainly now, the showrunner era, we know about Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat, but back in those days, they were just men in suits who made sure the programmes were made on budget and on time. And it's fascinating to learn that Innes Lloyd was actually a lot more creative than that, and he really fostered new writing talent and encouraged television to push at its boundaries. Absolutely brilliant documentary. Thoroughly recommended. So those two took me 3 hours to watch last night. The story took me 2 hours to watch. There are other things on here. There are commentaries, which I haven't listened to. I'm not a big commentary person. There is a photographic reconstruction of the story, which looks quite interesting. And I think that might be something I might watch at some point, because this is one of the stories that was photographed by a chap called John Cura, who at the time took lots of sort of images off the screen of TV things, lots of Doctor Who stuff. And we know a lot about missing Doctor Who from those photographs. I did watch part of episode 1, which gave you a really clear representation of how that episode looked and the location filming and so on. And there's also some surviving footage, which apparently was filmed on a tiny box video camera type thing by a fan in Australia. So we have this footage, which has now been married to the soundtrack. We can see Stephen leaving the show at the end of the 4th episode. And that's quite nice to see, because that's one of those companion exits that we've not seen before because the episodes are lost. And again, of course, that's one of the things about this story. Stephen Taylor leaves the series after being in it just over a year. And I think I've always thought that the ending was a bit, Stephen staying here to help this society rebuild itself. But there is actually a little bit of sort of emotional content too when you see it. Dodo is a bit upset that he's gone. And there's a respectful farewell between the Doctor and Stephen. So it's a bit better than we might have thought. So that's The Savages, really. It's a really good package. And I think if you were thinking of, it's not a very good story, I'll pass on that one, I would say to you, get it. Purely for those documentaries. If you're interested in not just the history of how Doctor Who was made, but the history of television, these two documentaries are just fascinating. I mean, maybe you're not interested in stuff like that. I know a lot of fans aren't. But I absolutely love that sort of stuff, and I just wallowed in that last night. I had a really good time with it. So in terms of rating this set, I'm going to give it 2 different ratings, because I'm going to rate the story, I'm going to rate the package. The story itself, The Savages, is what it is. And I hate that expression, but it is what it is. It's, mid-tier Doctor Who. But I think if you could just see the originals, it might not be. However, I'm going to give it 6 out of 10 for the story. And for the whole package, with the extras and all the bits and bobs, the bells and whistles, this gets an 8.5 out of 10 from me. 8.5 out of 10. Absolutely terrific. I did wonder about these 2 documentaries. It does seem strange to make these lavish documentaries for an animated Blu-ray release. So I do think that they might be documentaries. In fact, I'm almost certain that they will turn up when we eventually get a season 3 Blu-ray collection. So I suspect that those are being commissioned for that. And because that set is probably a long way down the line, they've been released now for us to see these documentaries now, because they're too good not to see as soon as possible. Season 3 on Blu-ray is, as I say, a long way away, because there's lots of missing episodes. There's a lot more animation to be done. So I think I can understand why they put these documentaries out now, because they are terrific documentaries in their own right, regardless of the fact that they have this Doctor Who connection. Right, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. It's gone on a bit longer than I thought, but I wanted to give it a full look, because I know there's lots of unboxings out there, but I don't know if there's many videos going in depth into the content of the set so far. So I wanted to do that because I respect you and I know that's what you want. If you're new here because you've stumbled across this Doctor Who video, please stick around because there's a lot more Doctor Who to come. Obviously, the new season is coming up in the next few weeks. I was going to do a video on the weekend about the episode title reveals, but as soon as they were revealed, there were umpteen YouTube videos going on for hours trying to theorize what the episodes might be about, what the themes of the series might be. Let's just watch it and find out and enjoy it without worrying about it too much before it comes on. I will be doing episode reviews week by week for the new series. A lot of Doctor Who stuff to come, so if you're a Doctor Who fan, click that subscribe button, click that like button, leave a comment down below. If you want to get your hands on one of these delicious Keep Taking the Stuff t-shirts, there's also a link in the description where you can do that thing. Right, thank you for watching. I'll see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.